But you have to record it.
Okay, so I guess we'll start. Before we get into how to win with judges, I guess we'll introduce ourselves. I'm Zach. I am the tournament director for the NYPDL. I have been debating for 4 years, and I've also done a lot of judging, mostly for the NYPDL, but also for some middle schoolers here and there. So I am more of a quote unquote flow judge. We'll talk about what that means in a few minutes.
And I'm Avi Berg. I'm Zach's dad. Actually, I have 2 kids who both debated. So they both started in middle school. So this is going to be my 7th year of judging debates. So while I have some experience judging, I've never actually debated myself, which gives me a little slightly different perspective than you guys who have engaged, who are going to, or have already engaged in debate. And I'll give you a sense of kind of what that means from our perspective as we go forward.
Okay, so with that, we're going to start with the following premise, which is that debaters, including myself, I'm guilty of this too, love to complain about their judges because they always say, oh, but I mentioned this for 5 seconds in this speech and my judge didn't hear it. But remember that debate is the art of persuasion. And at the end of the day, the team that wins is the team that is best able to persuade the judge. And there are some exceptions where it's just blatantly bad judging. For example, if the judge like literally is in another room or will only vote for one side before the round because that is their like belief before the round. But there are a lot of times where debaters do complain about judges and it isn't entirely fair because yes, although it might be nice to have experienced judges, having different types of judges is reflective of the real world where you're going to have to persuade different types of people. And at the end of the day, people are humans and they are going to be judging the debate based on how they feel and how they have felt persuaded throughout the course of the debate.
Zach, if I could just interject for 1 second. If anyone has a question during the talk, please feel free to put it in the chat. We'll monitor it. And then of course we'll have questions at the end if you want to wait to the end. But if you have something that's like right on target, that you just need an answer right away, just stick it in the chat. Okay, sorry, Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, also like we'll be monitoring the chat, but like if we for whatever reason don't answer your question, just like scream it out. I don't mind being interrupted at all. Okay, so this is probably what most of you think when you look at your judge and you're like, okay, my judge has experience, let's go, or this is a novice judge, darn it. But what in actuality yields debate success is debaters who are able to adapt to different judges and not those who are only able to win with a judge that has more experience. So how exactly do you know whether a judge has experience? So NYPDL has just moved to Tab Room, which is the platform that now pretty much every Parley tournament you're going to go to is going to use. On Tab Room, next to your judge's name, when you get like your pairings for the round, you'll see a little P, and that P stands for paradigm, and it essentially is where judges can tell debaters how much experience they have, what they are looking for in a debater. And you can use that paradigm to help adapt your debate style to best convince that specific judge. A few notes here. First, some judges don't have paradigms. I would assume that if you see a judge without a paradigm, that they're probably an inexperienced judge, because most experienced judges go through the effort to fill out a paradigm. I personally think that most inexperienced judges should also go through that same effort, but they don't also always do that. And then second note here is that in addition to the paradigm, you can also see their judging history, which will show all of the rounds that they've judged on Tab Room. And you can see how many rounds they've judged there, which can give you a pretty good sense of how much experience they have, which will allow you to kind of determine the best way that you're able to adapt. So with that, there are a couple types of judges. We're going to start with the type of judge that I am, which is a flow judge. And they usually have experience debating, coaching, or judging, most likely debating, and they will flow the round, which essentially means that they're going to like be taking, they'll be flowing, they'll be taking notes, how debaters take notes, and essentially like writing down everything that is said to the level that the debaters are doing it themselves, if not to a more detailed extent. And they are also more likely to be quote unquote tech over truth. And what this means is that they'll vote on what was said in the debate and are less likely to vote based on what they believe is faulty logic. So for example, if someone made an argument that they believed was incredibly far-fetched and that they believe is not applicable to the real world at all, but the other team would doesn't refute it, they're still going to buy that argument, even though they think it has a lot of holes, they think it's far-fetched, etc. So there's a few things that you are going to want to avoid with lay judges. We're going to talk about what that means, but for now you can just think of it as the opposite of a flow judge, someone who doesn't have experience. So there's some things that you want to avoid with inexperienced judges that you can use with flow judges. Something that's just important to note is like debater jargon. So when you're with a flow judge, it's often beneficial to use debater jargon just because it'll save you speech time. So for example, instead of saying, now I'm going to give a comparative analysis and prove why our impact is more important than theirs, you can just say, now I'm going to weigh the debate. It's probably going to save you a lot of time, and the flow judge is probably going to understand what that means. Second thing, which I briefly touched upon on the previous slide, is high magnitude but low probability impacts. So flow judges are more likely to vote on when teams say, well, this is going to cause extinction from a nuclear war. Things that probably have a very low probability in the real world. However, they have some small probability and have a really large impact. And if they're weighed properly by that team, it's pretty likely that the flow judge is going to heavily consider it and possibly vote on it. So with that, what are some ways that you can win the round when you do see in that paradigm / judging record that this judge has a lot of experience? First and most important thing is that you should weigh. Like 90% of in 90% of rounds, both teams still have some form of offense left, especially with flow judges, because flow judges are going to be looking at every piece of offense that is read in the round. What that means is that it usually in those 90% of rounds will come down to which team's offense they prove that that offense is more important than the other teams. And that's where weighing comes in. And if you don't weigh with a flow judge, it has very likely will lose you the round. With a lay judge, it probably isn't going to be as important. Second major thing is on dropping arguments. So since they're going to be taking notes in as detailed a way as you are going to be as debaters, they're going to notice when you drop arguments. So you need to be really careful to make sure that you're acknowledging every argument and make sure that you're not ignoring any arguments on the flow. But on the contrary, also realize that your opponents can suffer from the same thing. And that if they fail to respond to an argument, if you point it out and make it an important like voting issue, the flow judge is probably going to view that in a positive light. Third thing that you can do to win a flow judge's ballot is have multiple paths to the ballot and multiple lines of refutation against their paths to the ballot. So with a more inexperienced judge, when you go 8 reasons that their like main contention isn't true, they're probably going to be like, that's not really that important. I don't really remember each one that well. It's not going to be that impactful. However, if you have multiple lines of refutation with a flow judge, they're probably going to be like, oh, well, even if I don't buy X refutation, Y refutation still stands, and therefore I don't buy their case. This also has to do with your offense, though, in a couple of ways. A, you should probably have multiple pieces of offense that you're talking about in the rebuttal speeches. So the prime minister rebuttal and the leader of opposition rebuttal. But second, weighing in itself creates multiple paths to the ballot because you can prove that your offense is more important than theirs or prove that they have no offense. That in itself is two paths to the ballot. Also, once again, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. I know I'm moving kind of quickly because this lecture time is only 30 minutes and we started late. Fourth way you can pick up flow judge's ballot is by using creative argumentation. Oftentimes when I'm judging around and there is an argument that is made that I've never heard before, I find it like very just like refreshing. I find it like nice to hear that they're not just using kind of the same old case. And I think that sometimes you see the opposite with lay judges where they'll be like, lay judges will be like, oh, well, this is not what I was expecting the argument to be. I feel like they missed out on this argument. They're more kind of susceptible to this confirmation bias. However, flow judges are often impressed when you do like unique forms of argumentation that the judge had not thought of prior to the debate. Fifth way you can win rounds with flow judges is by using language that is referring to the flow. So remember that your flow judge is going to be flowing the round the same way you are, and therefore you want to make sure that when you're talking as though they are flowing as well. So that means that you can use language when you're signposting, i.e. saying like what you're talking about, that refers to the flow. So instead of having to say, I'm going to start by refuting their first argument, which talks about blah, 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 and spending 30 seconds summarizing their argument, you can just say, start at the top of their case, or I'm going to start by refuting their first contention. Similarly, you also want to make sure that you are cross-applying like what you are saying to other points on the flow. So just because you say it in your case, if you don't like cross-apply it as a refutation, a flow judge might not necessarily, quote, do that work for you because they want the debaters to be making their job as a judge as easy as possible. And therefore if you want something to be a certain place on their piece of paper / computer, you need to make sure that you are directing them to do that. Okay, for the more advanced debaters here, 3 advanced tips for how to pick up a flow judge's ballot. First is by reading offense in the member speeches. This is a really good way if you're on government to pull through offense into PMR because if the turn is conceded, it's just like conceded offense going into the last speech, but B, there's probably going to be less responses to it, even if there is a response, because the op block is going to have to be like concerned about A, like making sure that their case stands, and B, making sure that your contentions don't. On opposition, reading a lot of turns in the member of opposition speech is a really good way to make whoever is giving the prime minister rebuttal speech 10 times harder because they have to respond to all of that offense or else there's conceded offense going in. Keep in mind, though, with flow judges, if you are going to be reading turns, it's probably best to weigh them or else they're probably not going to be a main voting issue. Second major thing is engaging with the other team's weighing. So instead of just both teams building up their own individual weighing, i.e. one team saying, oh, we outweigh on scope, and the other team being, we outweigh on time frame, say, we outweigh on time frame, they actually don't outweigh on scope. Here's why our scope is larger in addition to the time frame, but even if you don't buy that, here's why time frame is more important than scope as a weighing metric. That type of engagement with weighing is going to give you a lot of leeway on, or give you like a big advantage on the quote unquote weighing debate, which is, as I flagged at the beginning of this section, is really important for flow judges. Final advanced piece of advice for flow judges is including spikes in your case. Spikes are essentially responses to what you expect their major refutations are going to be. This makes it a lot easier in the member speeches to just refer to the spikes that you already presented in your case. It overall just strengthens your case and the narrative of your team throughout the entire debate.
So like a good debater, Zach crowded out all of my time. So I'm just going to go quickly through a couple of slides on lay judges, okay? So just quickly, we talked about this a little before. I have no experience debating, but in contrast to many lay judges, I'll actually flow the round, okay? So, and exclusively I'll vote on what ends up on my flow sheet. So Zach likes to call me a flay judge, but since I'm not supposed to go into too much jargon, I won't define myself. Some rounds are very obvious, but some rounds are really difficult to judge for anyone, even a experienced judge, let alone a lay judge. So I've been involved in a lot of 2-1 decisions. So you got to present yourself to everybody. And as Zach said before, make sure you read the paradigm before you start. And I would assume that if someone hasn't written the paradigm, they're not an experienced judge. Okay. All right. Next slide. All right. So how to win when you have a lay judge. Okay. The most important things to consider: speak slowly. Okay. Spreading does not help a lay judge. If it's not, even with me, I've been doing this for a long time. If it's not, doesn't show up on my flow sheet, it doesn't count. So if I don't process the argument, then you're not going to get credit for it. As Zach said, too much debate jargon. If you're saying that your spike is taking out your opponent's turn, it won't be considered. What does that mean? I don't know what that means. And the last thing is that have clear and highly probable link chains. Okay, if the link chain becomes too far-fetched, or if there's so many steps that it becomes very small probability that you'll end up at the end, a lay judge will most likely be more likely to dismiss the argument. Okay, and lay judges are more likely to just fill in the blank. So don't assume that if your opponents haven't addressed something that you don't need to address it. Right? You can't say, oh well, they didn't just address it, and you use your own knowledge to address it. Assume that the lay judge is going to stick in their own opinion, and you have to address it. Even if it's garbage, like the argument is garbage, you have to say it's garbage. Okay, just to make sure. Okay, next slide. As you can tell, this is what Zach included in my slides here, but more clarity, my ballot. Okay, next slide. So things that'll make a lay judge like you. Okay. If they aren't flowing, it has to make an impact so that they remember your argument. Okay. So how do you do that? So for me personally, I think it's very impactful when all the arguments are internally consistent. And conversely, when you point out that your opponents aren't. So example, if you argue war is bad, let's say morally or something, and you also argue that war helps the economy, which increases fossil fuel usage, which will lead to climate change, that's, either war is bad or war is not bad, right? If it helps the economy, then that could be good. And so then it makes me confused as to whether war is actually bad or good and how you're getting there. And so, you have to be very clear on all the link chains, and all the parts of the link chains have to be consistent. If you say something for 1 second, and the last thing is clearly signpost. Zach kind of mentioned it, that with experienced judges, you could just say, I'm going to the top of their case and just kind of go down. Make clear what you're talking about. Don't just say you're refuting their third contention. They may not know what you're talking about. If they're not flowing, they don't have a third contention on a piece of paper. Okay, and they probably don't remember. Next slide. So the things that not to do, okay? Zach mentioned this. This is sort of his thing. I haven't seen this before, even in my take, but high magnitude, low probability impacts. Zach has seen it, that it doesn't work so well with lay judges. I'm not sure I've seen it, but that's, but keep that in the back of your head. I think the idea of sort of relying on esoteric rules, like how do I frame the debate in a way that narrows it down? Like a lay judge will be like, that doesn't make sense to me, I'll just eliminate it. And you're like, but that's the debate rule, that I'm the first speaker, I can frame it. And you know, you're out of luck. Okay. And that is much more likely to happen with a lay judge. And also with far-fetched arguments, like, you know, you're supposed to, as a judge, just listen to what the debaters say. But, you know, it's harder for a lay judge. You know, they know something and they think they can add to it. And oftentimes they'll just interject what they want to say. You know, they say, well, that's not true. And, you know, so this is the truth over whatever, I don't know, whatever he's called it, Zach. I don't even remember what the words are. So be careful with those kind of arguments. And the last thing I'd say is, you know, I'd be really careful with political arguments. Okay, so I've heard many times an argument like this: if we do X, whatever X is, then more Democrats will win, and then there's a better chance of doing something on climate change, which will save the world. Okay, now I'm a Democrat, and that argument pisses me off. Okay, so I can only imagine what it will do with a Republican judge. So as with anything, look, if you hit it right, it may work. But it's a very highly risky strategy. And honestly, I would just avoid politics in total. Like I just wouldn't even go there. It's just, you know, it's a toss up. And if maybe if the opponents are so good that you don't think you can win unless you do some Hail Mary, maybe that's when you pull it out. But otherwise, I would do it. All right, next slide. And so I would be like a little bit more concerned again about running sort of an extinction case. Or an esoteric case with a lay judge. So we left you a lot of time to ask questions. So
we actually pushed it back to 3:05. So we do have like 7 minutes for questions.
Perfect.
Which is going to be really awkward if there aren't questions after we pushed it back. But hopefully there are questions. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or honestly just shout it out.
How do you know if you have a lay judge? Like, will they say?
Yeah, so the first thing that you should check is the on the website that the NYPDL uses, there will be a little P next to your judge's name. And when you click on that P, it's the judge's space to say how long they've like been judging for, how experienced they are. So most experienced judges will be like, I debated in high school, lots of experience in that space. They'll probably say other things as well. Lay judges will either not have anything there or will be like, parent judge, keep that in mind, or something to that extent. If there isn't a paradigm, you should probably assume that your judge is not experienced. But another thing that you can also use is the judging history, which also appears on the website when you click on a judge's name. So when you click on the judge, you'll see the paradigm and the judging history, and you can use a combination of those two things to determine whether the judge is a flow judge or a lay judge.
Yeah, I think NYPDL used Discord though. So if you just did
Switch to
NYPDL,
tab room now.
I know, but if you had done everything on Discord, then it wouldn't be on tab room, would it?
Yeah, which was one problem with MIT tab. But yes, now you can.
But the other things definitely hold for sure. And late in the year, obviously, you'll know more.
Also, you can usually tell if they're flowing based on their camera after the first speech. So worst case scenario, you can look to see if they're writing stuff down / typing stuff in your first speech. Highly doubt it. Usually you can tell by the paradigm or judging record. But if for whatever reason you're at a tournament that isn't using tab room and you can't see those things or you're not sure, it's usually pretty clear to tell based on that. Any other questions?
Do you see in the chat, Zach?
Oh. Yes. So I'm actually giving a lecture tomorrow with Molly, who is the executive director, on jargon and making sure that you're not in that situation in the first place. But if you don't understand, there's a good chance the judge doesn't understand, but try to think about what you do understand. So if they're saying, like, our spike to this refutation was X, just think about X in a vacuum. What exactly is X? What is the analysis there? And therefore, you can respond to X and try to ignore the other words that were there. Did I say number?
No, I was just answering your question.
Oh, okay.
You asked what is X?
Yes, X is a letter. So you just want to like look at what X was, the analysis that's there, and try to ignore the like extra jargon that was included there. Because
Emily, are you referring to the contention itself or the like argument itself, or were you referring to just like the jargon around like a spike or something like that?
Oh, okay. So let's say you don't understand like the actual argument itself. I think that first thing you should do is that, especially online, I think a lot of teams have shifted away from having both speakers write refutations and only leaving the member speaker to do it all. I think that in general, this is probably really bad because you often get stuck in situations where only one person is like understanding the vocabulary of a contention, and sometimes that person isn't the member speaker. So I'd say first thing you should do is probably come up with a system such that the other person can on your team can try to like provide refutations if they understand the vocabulary. But let's say like neither of you do. You can usually once again try to like go around it. So what was their tagline? So like when they said our first contention is X, what was like the tagline? What is like the thesis of their argument? And if you don't understand some of the like minute details, oftentimes the judge won't ever know that you don't know that vocabulary if you're responding to like the general idea.
I would add honestly that if you can't understand what the contention is, then take a look at the link chain and see if you can get a weakness in the link chain, even if you don't know what a contention is. And if you can break the link chain somehow, then you can say, well, whatever the contention is, it's wrong because the link chain doesn't follow. Find something that you understand that you can attack that will make the judge question whether to even include it or not. That would be my
another
suggestion.
really good point. Yes, the recording and the slides will be sent out to all campers. It might be at the end of the camp, but all of the resources will be sent. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions about this lecture that we didn't have time to get to, / you didn't want to ask in front of everyone, feel free to text me. I think you all have my number from earlier. If not, you can also like DM me on Slack, whatever. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.